Welcome back to the Marvel Podcast for gifted listeners. I hope that you enjoyed learning about how magic works in the Marvel Universe. This episode, we are going to go outside the usual scope of the Marvel Universe, outside of the heroes, and look at properties that have been under the Marvel Comics banner, but some of them may not necessarily be canonical to the wider Marvel Universe, as in the 616 universe. Some just have their own distinctive universes, but are within the Marvel multiverse. Some we've seen cross over with the main characters, some kind of have stayed contained to their own little bubble universes. Sometimes the people who made these IPs wanted to publish comics, and they would ask Marvel, hey, can we use you guys to make our comics? Or, in some cases, Marvel would approach other companies to get the IPs. So we will explore all that in today's episode. But before we get into the episode, I just wanted to pull back the curtain a little bit and just let my little fan base in on why there's been a month hiatus between episodes. And that is because I got a promotion at work, and I've just been so busy at work that I've been extremely tired and also trying to do stuff other than just be at work. I haven't had that much time to work on the podcast. But I was able to finally finish putting this episode together, and I hope you guys really like it. And with that, let's get into it by looking at the first IP I became aware of that Marvel owned, and that would be the Men in Black. Like I said, the Men in Black were kind of the first IP I learned were a Marvel comic that weren't a Marvel comic, if that makes sense. I forgot how I found this out, but I found out that the Men in Black were technically a Marvel property, and that started after the 94 movie starring Will Smith. But rewind a few years before the movie came out, there was a standalone Men in Black comic that was published by Malibu Comics. That original comic was taken and turned into the 94 movie. And then after that, Marvel bought Malibu Comics, thus integrating the Men in Black into the Marvel universe. And yeah, so Men in Black is a Marvel comic. And the Men in Black are actually canonical to Earth 616. We don't really see them that often, but they're there in the background. The next property that we're going to look at is Conan the Barbarian. People probably have heard this name, seen some of the movies. Maybe, hey, if you're that big a nerd, maybe you've read the original book by Robert E. Howard. That book was written in 1906. Honestly, MCU book, you probably read it. If you read The Hobbit, you probably read Conan the Barbarian. In the 1970s, Roy Thomas, who was the editor-in-chief at Marvel at the time, would acquire the rights to the character when he bought it from Robert E. Howard's estate. Roy Thomas would go on to be the sole writer of the book for the first 115 issues. The comic would go on for over 300 issues. And Conan would also be part of the main 616 universe, but we would actually see him interact more with the main cast of heroes that we know. Conan would actually be part of the Savage Avengers, who we will dive deeper into when I do a future episode on different Avengers teams, because, like I've mentioned in past episodes, there's a lot of them. Also, the Druids that we had discussed in the previous episode, the black, red, and yellow Druids, their origins come from the Conan comic. And that is how Druidic magic became part of Marvel's greater magic umbrella. The Conan comics would be reused as comic strips in Sunday Morning Comics as well. Dark Horse, who is another comic book company that if you read graphic novels, you probably know them. I know them most from doing the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics. they would do a Conan comic as well, but it was not linked to the Marvel Comics version at all. In 2018, Marvel would reacquire the rights to Conan the Barbarian, and they would start writing new Conan comics in 2019. Next up, we have the Halo comics. Now, I like the Halo games, but I was just too young to kind of get into the original Halo hype and be as deep into it as I would be now if Halo were out, like coming out now. But I know that there was that fan base. And when the game came out, the team behind the game wanted to expand upon the Halo universe and fill in the gaps of the story that would have been set off camera that we would not have seen in the cinematics of the video game. Microsoft's head of franchise development, Eric Trumpman, assembled a team to write the graphic novels for the Halo franchise. But the team who ran Bungie, the creative minds behind Halo, they didn't like this product they had put together. So, after this, Pete Parsons, the head of Bungie, put together his own team of comic writers and made a graphic novel he thought would make a good comic. Parsons approached Alan Moore and Joe Kubert to work on the graphic novel, but couldn't get either to sign on. Bungie would assemble a team of writers and artists to create the graphic novel that they really believed would work well. But the only problem was they didn't have a publisher for said comic, and so they would turn to Marvel Comics to be the publisher, because they said that Marvel had had a passion for Halo, and they had a wide reach in the comic industry. Upon release, Publishers Weekly called the Halo graphic novel a rare hit for the game's comic genre, debuting at the second position on both the Nielsen Bookscan and Diamond sales charts. Marvel reported they expected to print 100,000 copies by the end of the year, and the comic continued to be one of the top-selling graphic novels months after its debut. In late 2007, the Pittsburgh Tribune Review called it Marvel's best-selling graphic novel. The success of the novel actually led Marvel Comics and Bungie to announce a 4-issue miniseries, a 4-issue monthly Halo comic series, at the 2006 San Diego Comic-Con, and this series would be called Halo Uprising. And despite delays, the first issue of the limited series was released on August 22nd, 2007. And the last issue would be released in June 2009. And Dark Horse, who we talked about a little bit earlier, they would make their own Halo comics, releasing new graphic novels in 2021. So those are still available. Those are now available to read. This next IP is very interesting that is part of the Marvel Universe. I actually discovered that it was part of the Marvel Universe when I was at Comic-Con and saw one of the first issues at Comic-Con. And I actually believe I bought it. I have to double check my comic collection. But if I did, I will post it on the Instagram. And I am talking about The Doctor. Doctor Who. In the tail end of the 1970s, Marvel had a branch in Europe known as Marvel UK, and the BBC transferred the license to their beloved Doctor to the comic company. For a while, Marvel UK was the sole license holder, though this gradually changed through the 1990s, after which BBC Magazines, Immediate Media Company, and Titan Comics began printing separate Doctor Who comic books, magazines, and collected graphic novels in the UK concurrent with the Doctor Who books of Marvel. Meanwhile, in the United States in the 1980s, Marvel would print colorized reprints of the Doctor Who magazine comic strips in the monthly comic book called Marvel Premiere and Doctor Who. And they would also have US versions of what they called Doctor Who Classic Comics. Between 1992 and 1996, Marvel also published Doctor Who yearbooks, which were basically Doctor Who annuals, like how we get big annual books of X-Men, Spider-Man, Avengers. But these were focused on Doctor Who. Marvel also occasionally printed some single-issue Doctor Who comics, and they would market them as quote-unquote graphic novels. Of these, only The Age of Chaos was both wholly graphic and a single novel-length story. The other stories, such as Absalom Dac, Dalek Killer, and Voyager, would be considered by North American audiences to be trade paperbacks or collector's editions. And even though the Doctor would actually cross over with a handful of Marvel's main characters, such as the Hulk, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four, they would combine the UK variants and create a timeline that diverged from Earth 616. And this is what people eventually started referring to as the Marvel UK universe. The Doctor Who universe is distinguished as Earth 5556 in the Marvel multiverse and was given its official distinction in 2006 in All New Official Handbook of the Marvel Universe A to Z number 7. And as of now, this is going to be the end of the section for Doctor Who. But in the future, I may do a bonus episode or a full episode about Doctor Who in the Marvel multiverse. Because honestly, even though I've only seen a few episodes of the show, I know the fandom's big, and it's actually really interesting that such a popular character is part of the Marvel universe. Next up is a very interesting addition to the Marvel universe. I mean, they're all interesting, but this one was interesting and funny for what it was and why it's a thing. But in the early 90s, Marvel would write a limited series known as NFL Super Pro, which would essentially be an NFL tie-in comic centering around Phil Grayfield, who is an ex-NFL player who survives a freak accident and would wear a near indestructible football uniform. And I know for sure I have this one. The comic had 2 crossovers with Marvel characters, featuring Spider-Man in issue 1 and Captain America in issue 8. The comic series is often referred to as one of Marvel's worst series ever written, and has now become somewhat of a cult collective object in Marvel's collective world. Honestly, I picked it up because I'm a huge Marvel fan, and I love the NFL. Go Bills. But the original writer of the comic, Fabian Nicieza, had admitted that he only wrote the story so that he could try to get some free NFL tickets. Which, honestly, can't blame the guy. And he still receives flack for the comic. After Nicieza had left the comic after issue 4, it was passed along to Buzz Dixon, who would write a few more issues of the book, and in his short run, he had a controversial issue where he made a group of Native Americans known as Hopi the villains of the story. The issue actually had to be recalled because of how insensitive it was to the native tribe. And the comic would actually wind up just kind of fizzling out. But interestingly enough, Phil Grayfield did have a small cameo in a recent Marvel project known as Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, which, if you haven't watched the show yet, it's a great show. And I'm very curious about the ending, and I have some questions, but I'm not going to say anything, because if you haven't seen it yet, I don't want to spoil it. But Phil Grayfield would actually be the coach of Rockford T. Bales High School. And outside of that little cameo, the character of NFL Super Pro has not been seen since the series cancellation. Although, writer Robert Kirkman reportedly wanted to use Super Pro in an issue of Marvel Team Up, but was prevented due to copyright issues. Which, you don't want to go up against the NFL when it comes to copyright. Now, if you've been paying attention to some of Marvel's special editions of things over the past few years, you'll have noticed the Godzilla crossover, which has been honestly really fun, at least in my opinion, because we've gotten some fun things such as Venomzilla, where the Venom symbiote took over Godzilla, or Godzilla became a Ghost Rider. But way back before any of this, back in the 1970s, before Venom even existed, shortly after Ghost Rider had even made his first appearance on the cover of a Marvel comic, there was the comic Godzilla King of Monsters, which is a 24-issue series of comics based on the kaiju. After 1975's failed movie known as The Terror of Mechagodzilla, the dubbed versions of the Godzilla movies were still popular in America. And guess who was a fan of those? None other than Stan Lee. Stan Lee was a fan of the movie and negotiated to get the licensing to Godzilla to be used in Marvel Comics. But when he did get the licensing, it only included the character of Godzilla, none of the supporting cast. So, no Ghidorah, no Mothra, no one. Literally just Godzilla. So, Marvel would make their own stories. Marvel didn't want Godzilla to defeat any of its main heroes, so they would have S.H.I.E.L.D. be the main adversary of Godzilla in the books. Specifically, Dum-Dum Dugan and Jimmy Woo. They would be the two main S.H.I.E.L.D. agents to deal with the radioactive lizard. In one issue, they used Pym particles to shrink Godzilla down to man size to allow Dum-Dum Dugan to take out the monster once and for all in hand-to-hand combat. Can you imagine the guy with the funny bowler hat punching Godzilla in the face? Godzilla would also cross over with the Fantastic Four, Avengers, the Champions, and Devil Dinosaur. And during Godzilla's run in Marvel Comics, Mattel would make toys for Shogun Warriors. Mattel would be impressed with how Marvel handled Godzilla and have them make a comic for the Shogun Warriors. But after 2 years of Marvel publishing the Godzilla King of Monsters comic, Toho, who had the rights to Godzilla, would raise the price of licensing out of nowhere. And Marvel was not willing to pay more money into the property if they didn't have sole ownership over the character, and also if it didn't include all the supporting cast. And because of this, that's why the comic only lasted 24 issues. But Dr. Dominicus, Yetrigar, and Red Ronin, who were characters that had been introduced in the Godzilla comic, would get folded into the greater Marvel universe and would be used as antagonists for the Shogun Warrior books. In 2007, Marvel would have an unauthorized Godzilla cameo in the Mighty Avengers. And, like I had mentioned in the beginning of the section, Godzilla has returned to Marvel Comics in 2025 in a limited capacity. And his time in Marvel will end soon and will be concluded with Godzilla Kills the Marvel Universe. And honestly, I can't wait to read that. And now we're going to kind of switch back to sci-fi. In 1976, Marvel published a treasury issue of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was a comic adaptation of the film with the same name. Creating this comic was one of Jack Kirby's stipulations to return to Marvel Comics after he had left to go to DC. In the original comic that they wrote, they basically followed the script of the film, but add in a few more lines of dialogue that came from the original novel, and would have a more colloquial version of HAL 9000. And for those of you who don't know what a treasury edition is of a comic, it's basically an edition of a Marvel comic that is in a larger, like, tabloid-sized book instead of the classic comic size. Shortly after they made the Treasury edition, there was a miniseries in the more traditional comic size that was published. In the 10-issue miniseries, the first 6 issues focused on Basically, they would replay the same ideas, but with different characters and different stories, in both prehistoric and futuristic times. In issue number 7, in June of 1977, the comic opens with the birth of a new seed, who then travels the galaxy, witnessing the suffering that men have caused each other, while the new seed is unable or unwilling to prevent this devastation. He takes the essence of the two doomed lovers and uses it to seed another planet with potential for human life. In issue number 8, Jack Kirby would introduce Mr. Machine, who is later renamed Machine Man. Mr. Machine is an advanced sentience, and Machine Man is an advanced robot designated X-51. All the other robots in the X series go on a rampage as they achieve sentience and are destroyed. X-51, supported by both the love of his creator, Dr. Abel Stack, and an encounter with Monolith, transcends the malfunction that destroyed his siblings. After the death of Dr. Stack, X-51 takes the name Aaron Stack and begins to blend to humanity. Issues 9 and 10, which would close out the series, would continue the story of X-51 as he flees destruction at the hands of the Army. In the third season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., there would be allusions to the series in episode 4722 Hours. And like I said, these comics and miniseries were essential to Jack Kirby returning to Marvel in the 70s. Next up, in what is kind of a reverse of Men in Black, where Men in Black, I learned that they were, Men in Black and then became a Marvel property. There was Rom, who I thought was just straight up a Marvel character, because when I got my first collection of comic books, there was Rom comics in there. But this wasn't entirely true with Rom, as Rom was created as a toy for Hasbro, and the toy had been first presented in the December 10th, 1979 issue of Time magazine. To promote the new toy, Parker Brothers would license the character to Marvel to make comics that would promote the toy so that they would be able to sell more. Because, toy sales make the world go round in comics and TV shows and movies. And funny enough, the comic would outlast the toy line. The toy line would be abandoned in 1980, but the comic would continue for another 6 years until 1986. The comic made the origin of Rom, where he was a human who would volunteer for the Space Knight program, where his body was replaced with a cyborg body, and he would be given a neutralizer, which, from what I've gathered, it worked similar to the Phantom Zone projector that Superman would use in his comics, where the neutralizer would banish the main villains into limbo. Most of Rom's comics would focus on him finding and banishing wraiths to limbo using the neutralizer. And Rom is part of the main Marvel universe, and would face some foes such as the Mad Thinker, the Space Phantom, Galactus, and his then hero Terrax. And he would also encounter heroes such as the X-Men, Power Man, and Iron Fist. He would also work with the Fantastic Four, Nova, the Thing independently from the Fantastic Four, and the Hulk. And Rom was one of the many heroes transported into the arena in space for the contest champions, even though he was not chosen to participate. In 1986, Hasbro would not let Marvel renew the rights to Rom, and that is what would cause the end of this series. In 2023, Marvel reacquired the rights to Rom and would reprint the comics in omnibuses, as well as release new Rom figures in their Marvel Legends series of action figures. Next up are the robots in disguise, and that is, of course, the Transformers. They The Transformers comic only kind of really shared its name with the TV show. The Transformer comic was intended to be a 4-issue miniseries about the transforming robots. The first generation series, though, would be so popular it would go on for 80 issues. In the 80th issue, it was labeled as issue 80 in a 4-issue miniseries. The comic did start off the same as the show, but besides that, that's where the similarities ended. Eventually, the series ended with Autobots Decepticons forming an uneasy alliance to defend Cybertron from Unicron. And over in the UK, Marvel's sister company that we have talked about before, Marvel UK, would go on to publish a much longer Transformers run that would run for 332 issues, 7 annuals, and 28 specials. The UK comic would be a weekly publication and would be able to flesh out the characters more and go more in depth with the stories of the robots. It was also able to delve deeper into their lore. Simon Furman would also try to keep the continuity with Transformers the movie, which was the animated movie, and wrote several stories after the movie's ending set in the future. After the 2 main series by Marvel US and Marvel UK, there were a handful of miniseries that did directly tie in with the animated movies. There was a 3-issue miniseries that tied into the first featured animated film. There was a 4-issue miniseries called Transformers Universe that would give details about all the Transformers, including ones that had been toys but would not be featured in the animated films. There was also a 4-issue limited series about the G.I. Joe and Transformers team-up that featured the 2 title characters as well as other Hasbro properties. After this run, the first Transformers series in the US would be dubbed as Generation 1 in the 90s, and then in the 90s, Marvel would make Transformers Generation 2, which would be a 12-issue series, and it would stay 12 issues. And they would expand on Generation 1 mythos and continue events that had started in the G.I. Joe Transformers crossover. And funnily enough, Generation 2 had the opposite effect of Generation 1, where instead of the UK version lasting longer, the UK version of Generation 2 would only last for 5 issues. And after this, in 2007, the Transformers would finally cross over with the main heroes of the Marvel Universe, crossing over with Captain America, Spider-Man, Wolverine, and Iron Man. The Marvel Comics character Death's Hand, a character created by Simon Furman, would appear in certain Marvel UK Transformer stories. In the 3rd issue of the all-new official handbook of the Marvel Universe A to Z, released in March of 2006, the entry for Death's Head described his encounters with the Transformers to have taken place in alternate reality, referred to as Earth 120185, thus separating these stories from existing in the 616 continuity. This raised the question of whether or not any of the Marvel Comics Transformer stories take place in 616 or this other universe, despite there being tie-ins such as Spider-Man's guest starring appearance in the original Marvel Limited series, and Circuit Breaker, a character that originated in the Transformers comics, having a cameo in Marvel's Secret Wars 2, which featured nearly every character that then existed in the continuity of Earth 616. A case can be made that only the stories that featured Death's Head are separate from the standard Marvel universe, since the character's adventures often involve traveling across time and dimensions, not to mention genres. Death's Head also encountered the British science fiction icon Doctor Who. But now let's move on from Cybertron and go to a different galaxy, one that was far, far away. Back in 1975, before Star Wars A New Hope released, Lucasfilm's publicity supervisor Charles Lippincott would approach Stan Lee about making a tie-in comic for Star Wars, but he wanted the comic to come out before the film did. Stan Lee didn't want to make a comic before the movie had been released. After the movie's release, there was another meeting between Stan Lee and Lippincott, and Lee was only persuaded to make the comic because of Roy Thomas. The original deal was that Lucasfilm would not collect any royalties until their Star Wars comic had sold 100,000 copies, because movie tie-in comics historically didn't sell well. The first comic went on sale in April of 1977 and sold extremely well. Jim Shooter, who was the editor-in-chief at the time of the Star Wars comics, said that Star Wars comics financially saved Marvel in 1977 and 78. The first 6 issues adapted A New Hope. In issue 7, there would be the first original stories set in the Star Wars universe in the series. Issues 39 through 44 would adapt The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi would be a separate 4-issue miniseries outside of the original 107-issue run for the Star Wars comic. The issues between movie adaptation comics would include origin stories and would build out the Star Wars universe. After Blackthorn Comics and Dark Horse Comics would adapt Star Wars stories in comics until 2014. When Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012, it was announced that Marvel would take over the Star Wars comic once again. And in 2014, Marvel announced that it would be producing 2 new Star Wars comics. And as of January of 2025, it was announced that there would be a reset to the comic Star Wars universe with Star Wars number 1, which will explore the timeline immediately after Return of the Jedi. And now the next few properties, there's not a whole lot about them, but they're going to be fun and just interesting. And to start off, we have Thomas the Tank Engine, which Thomas the Tank Engine was funny, because when I looked into all the previous IPs, I was able to find why Marvel got it, how they got it, but for whatever reason, for Thomas, I couldn't really find that much out. Like why it's even a Marvel comic, or if they cross over into the main Marvel universe. I'm assuming they haven't, since the only reference to Thomas and other Marvel properties is in the MCU, with Thomas the Tank Engine toy appearing in 2015's Ant-Man. And it is also weird because Marvel made 304 issues of Thomas the Tank Engine between 1987 and 1999. And if you're really dying to read these, I happen to find an X-user known as @King of the TWR, who has been uploading the comics to their X page for a few years, where they have every issue in a drive that you can read off of their X page. But besides that little bit, I couldn't really find much else about Thomas the Tank Engine in the Marvel Comics. But let's get musical and talk about a few musicians who have had either appeared in the universe or had their own actual comics. Probably one of the most well-known ones would be Kiss, who appeared in Howard the Duck number 12 and will appear again in issue 13. And I think it's funny that they debuted in a Howard the Duck comic, because in an episode of What If on Disney Plus, the one where Howard the Duck and Darcy Lewis get together, I Was Made for Lovin' You would be a central part of the episode, even so much that it allowed their daughter to hatch by them singing the song. After their appearance in the Howard the Duck comics, Kiss would be featured in Marvel's first issue of Marvel Super Special Series. For this special edition of the Kiss comic, each member of the iconic band would donate a small portion of blood, and this donation was overseen by a registered nurse and witnessed by a notary. The blood would then be mixed into the ink that was used to print the comic. And this one-shot series of Marvel Super Special Series would go on for 41 issues, featuring a multitude of pop culture icons. Some some of which were The Beatles, Star Trek, and even Little Orphan Annie. And just a little bit more fun trivia, Paul McCartney is a huge Marvel fan and actually wrote a song called Magneto and Titanium Man, which would feature Marvel characters. The other probably well-known musician that was part of the Marvel Universe was Alice Cooper, who was first featured in Marvel Premiere number 50 and would be a consulting writer to write himself within the books. And before we're finished with today's episode, we have one more IP to cover and an honorable mention in today's bizarre and company-spanning episode, and that is Alf. Alf would have his own comic series under the Marvel Comics banner that lasted 4 years, and would parody some of Marvel's heroes in the issues. The storylines of the comic would mimic storylines of the TV show, and the comic would go on for 50 issues. And our honorable mention is going to be one that it was a Marvel comic since 1998, but I feel most people don't know it as a Marvel comic because of its more recent animated adaptation in 2014, and that would be Big Hero 6, which I feel if you're not really knowledgeable in how many things are Marvel characters, you might not have known that the animated movie was based off of Marvel characters. And with that, I hope you have learned a bit more about properties that are Marvel, but not really. Properties that have had Marvel comics slapped on their titles, but may not be part of the main 616 universe. And with that, we're going to look at the top 5 things we learned in today's episode. Number 1. Marvel would acquire the license for many properties throughout their history to write comics for those specific licenses, and sometimes they would cross over into 616 or an adjacent universe. Number 2. Doctor Who is a Marvel character who has crossed over with multiple characters and was mainly featured in Marvel UK comics. Number 3. There is a limited series of comics that feature an ex-NFL star that was tied into the NFL only so that the writer could hopefully get some free NFL tickets. Number 4. Godzilla was a prominent character in Marvel Comics for a handful of years before Toho raised the licensing fee on the comic and Marvel decided not to renew their license, but the giant lizard has made a recent return to Marvel Comics, and I'm excited to read how Godzilla kills the Marvel Universe. And number 5, probably one of my favorite Marvel trivia facts. When Kiss was featured in the first book of a Marvel series called Marvel Comics Super Special, each member of the band had blood drawn, and it was notarized that this blood was drawn, and their blood was mixed into the ink and used to make the comic. And with that, I hope that you now know a bit more about properties that have technically been a Marvel comic. Honestly, some of these comics I want to do deep dives into in full episodes, but because there's just so much more to these stories than I covered in their little blurbs in this episode. And that's because this episode is meant to be a glance at the greater Marvel Universe outside of our typical heroes. If you want me to cover any of them in specific, I will try my best to dive deeper into them. Just let me know in a comment or an email. In the next episode, we are going to go back to a character bio episode, and I'm going to do a deep dive into Victor Von Doom, aka Doctor Doom. I've known a little bit about this character from different stories, but I truly want to dive deep into his history, his powers, and his story. And I hope you will join me next time when I do this. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by myself, James Basinski. Intro music, outro music, and timeline sounds were sourced from freesound.org. You can find us on Instagram at TMPFGL, TikTok at TMPFGL, YouTube at The Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners. And if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions, you can send them in email to tmpfgl@gmail.com. To join our fun little community on Discord, there will be a link in the description. Please like, subscribe, and rate the show wherever you listen. And until next time, gifted listeners, thank you for listening, and Excelsior!